Hey guys, given that my opponent is using quite a few subpoints to prove one underlying point, I'm going to try to group them together as much as possible while hopefully hitting all the main points provided by the con. I'm going to do this hopefully to save time as I would like to fit in as much as argumentation as possible. First, my opponent's contention 1. First off, my opponent has attempted to narrow this debate down to being as one-sided as possible through the use of posting arguments that fit those who reside in the United States' general moral beliefs. Given that obviously most Americans would agree that concepts such as sex trade, genocide, child labor, racism, etc. are unethical, a general bias is going to be towards the con side of this debate. However, I would like to ask the voters to disregard these certain aspects of belief, given that Khan agreed to having this debate be as generic as possible and not subjective or objective related. Khan said, quote, "As long as I prove X is more efficient than Y, I link the point to the resolution. In terms of effectiveness, I have to question whether my opponent actually even did this or not, as most of his arguments are manipulative attempts at directing a bias towards the voters. My opponent hasn't really proven with his case that X is necessarily better than Y at all. While the concept of consequentialism makes a great contention, my opponent has not really shown some empirical analysis saying that the other side's answers are necessarily wrong, which basically drops his whole arguments. Going on to the individual arguments in my opponent's contention 2. Subpoint A, genocide. Before I begin with the arguments on these individual subpoints, I would like again to ask the voters to push aside personal bias, as the purpose of this debate is not determining whether political decisions have moral societal consequences, but rather if they're logistically right or wrong according to the people arguing both for and against both positions. Even darfur names such as genocide are hard to tag as political decisions, as those committing the genocide are not supported in the government operations. Also, the definition of genocide, which states acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, doesn't really fit in with the actual intentions of the government. The political decision isn't actually backed with the intention to destroy a national ethnic group, thus rendering my opponent's attempt at a utilitarianism aspect useless. My opponent also never cites implicit consent. Actions from the Holocaust should be disregarded as they were vastly taking the one-sided approach that my opponent agreed not to use. Given that actions taken in the Holocaust were driven by one potentially sick man, we cannot really classify this as an example, also given that it is not an explicit, conflicting political decision that is never faced in our world's political decisions today. Please see source 1. Going on to my opponent's contention, subpoint B of child labor laws, again, he's generalizing his approach to this statement from general American viewpoints. According to American lifestyles, children should be at school or work or play. Yet the fact remains that there are third world nations where the economy is such that families need their children to work to supplement their meager incomes. Like it or not, child labor exists and in some places makes the difference between true hunger and abject poverty or just barely surviving. My opponent cannot find any underlying universal aspect that would make this answer being wrong or even a possibility. Thus, please disregard this as a subpoint. See source 2. Next is subpoint C of sex trade. This point is also irrelevant as my opponent does not directly link this point to as a political decision, rather a marketing ploy in which he says it is condoned by the government. However, it is not necessarily a strong supported ideal represented by the government. In fact, it is illegal. Even if this was so, my opponent has yet to prove how it would be universally detrimental to all humans to disallow sex trade, as I have said to him in other subpoints. See source 3 and also look at source 4 for an economical value of sex trade. In order to avoid repeat arguments and save time, I am going to cross-apply and extend all arguments to a group subpoint thesis for my opponent. Please look to the links of each arguments against each individual subpoints. Also, racism, war rape, and exploitation of women are irrelevant as they are not specific political arguments. See source 4, racism is in a political decision. Source 5, exploitation of women. No source needed as I asked my opponent not to bring up religious prospects as political arguments. See source 6, war rape, also not a political decision. My opponent's contention 3 argument should be disregarded as my opponent is merely stating facts that he believes to be true rather than speaking universally that no matter what fiscal responsibility is needed to in order to be economically safe. This in and of itself is included as a personal bias because he cannot speak for the people who are averse to this concept as well. Thus we can drop his arguments my opponent makes as well, going on to my own case. Contention 1. My opponent says that we can test certain results to see what each probable result will be. This demands an inclination that only one side can and will be correct as an overarching value. This simply disregards the fact that there can be a situation where both sides can be proven to be empirically mutual. My opponent has to prove some sort of argument somehow proving that mutual gain from either side is virtually impossible, which he has not done, meaning you have to further extend this argument. Next, my opponent says, I confirm non-mutuality with the use of my MLM example. However, he doesn't exactly say how, and I in fact do the opposite. I prove that there are known benefits and negative consequences, making it overall impossible to say that an MLM is either a good or a bad decision. So again, please extend this point. Going on to my contention 2, my opponent makes a vastly unsupported and irrelevant argument with heliocentric claims made in medieval times. This point doesn't directly touch down on what I am saying because those political debates were arguing on theory rather than statistical information and fact-based knowledge, which is presently available. Thus, I can still extend this contention. Obviously, long disputes are unsettled because of conflicting fact-based information. My opponent says one is right and one is wrong. This needs vast clarification, however. Contention 3. My opponent misses the point of this my third contention entirely. What I'm trying to say is that it is impossible to justify a right or wrong universal claim with such strong support and evidence supporting both sides. Logically speaking, my opponent needs more than just a statement of, well, one is more right than the other just because. It is for all these reasons that I strongly urge you, the voters, to vote pro.